Hey guys, so in this video I want to try and make a cutting board with a mountain scene in it, and I'm gonna go ahead and say it now, this might be an epic failure, but if it works I think it's gonna be pretty cool. And just as a little background, I'm a Florida man. Well, not Florida man, that guy gets a lot of bad publicity, but I'm a Florida raised. I've been here pretty much all my life, but it's not really the state that I would choose to be in. I'm not a beach guy. I want mountains. Pretty much any trip that my family and I do, it's going to be somewhere in the mountains, whether it's Western Carolinas, Tennessee, North Georgia, something like that. But in the summer of 2019, we took a trip out west and we went to 9 national parks in Utah, Arizona, Wyoming, and Montana. And in Wyoming especially, I fell in love with Teton Range. Something about it just, I don't know, it's, if you've been there, you know what I'm talking about. It's absolutely beautiful. And I'm always trying to incorporate kind of mountain scenes or pictures, art, whatever, into our house. So I thought a mountain themed cutting board would be pretty cool. And if I'm gonna do mountain, why not use the Teton Range? So there are, I think, a few ways that I could do this, or someone could do this. One way, the easiest way, would be to use a CNC machine, but I have neither the room in my garage nor the money to buy a CNC machine, so that one's out. I think the second option would be to do kind of an inlay approach with a router, but I don't feel overly comfortable with that one. I'm not sure that would turn out exactly the way I want, so I'm going to take option 3, which is essentially to create 2 half cutting boards, one with this hard maple and one with this quarter sawn white oak. And once those are put together, overlay them, cut out the Teton Range and one of the boards, and then trace that onto the second one and do another cut. So I'll have a maple skyline and an oak mountain range, or vice versa. Either way, we'll see. So that's kind of the idea. And like I said, this might not work. I don't know. We'll see. But I'm going to give it a shot. So first thing I need to do, of course, is to turn these boards into 2 cutting boards. So let's get started. I want the cutting board width to be about 18 inches. And I say about because I know I'm going to lose some width when I trim up the ends near the end of the process. But 18 is close enough. So I'm going to go ahead, cut the maple and white oak boards down to 18-inch pieces, just to make the next step a little bit more manageable and easy. After I'm done at the miter saw, I can jump over to the table saw and take those 18-inch pieces and rip down strips that are 1.5 inches wide. And these, of course, will then be turned the other way and glued up together to be the edge grain of the edge grain cutting board. And once I have all of my strips cut, I can go ahead and start working on the glue up. And just to save time, I'm going to go ahead and glue up these 2 boards at the same time. So I've got my white oaks stacked together and my maples. And of course, just making sure not to glue those inside maple and oak pieces. Don't want to make one board where I should have 2. So once those boards have had pretty much a full day for the glue to set, I can go ahead and take them out of the clamps. But before I run them through the planer, I like to take a hand chisel and just kind of work away some of those spots where there's a lot of heavy glue buildup, just to make sure that way when I run it through the planer, I'm working with a truly flat surface and don't create more trouble for myself. But once that's done, I can go ahead and run these boards through the planer, just cleaning them up and then making sure when it's done that both boards are the exact same thickness. Okay, so at this point in the process, we now have 2 cutting boards, 1 maple, 1 white oak, that have been glued up and planed down to equal thickness. So we can go ahead and start working on the actual mountain range cut. And while I was waiting for the glue up to happen, I had an epiphany, or I think it was an epiphany. This might be a worse idea, I'm not really sure. But my original plan for this was to take the board outline the Teton Range, cut that out here, and then trace that to the other board and then make a second cut. Now the problem is that's going to require me to make what I think would be a more precise cut on the second board. So my new plan of attack is to do a single cut. So what I'm going to do is basically overlap these boards about like that, and then attach them with some blue painter's tape and CA glue so that they're stable. And I also planed out a kind of an extra strip to put underneath the outside of this one, so that way when it's on the table, it'll have support on that side, so I'm less likely to have any type of wobble. But anyway, that way I'll be able to make a single cut for the range, which again I'll trace out on this white oak. But I think that's going to give less chance of error for the end product. Again, I've never done this before, so I'm simply guessing, but I think that's going to work better. So let's go ahead and start working on that. And before I can start working on that approach, I need to actually make the outline for my Teton Range. And I don't trust myself to do this by hand, so I had my wife cut out a piece, technically 2 pieces of vinyl from an image that is essentially the outline of the Teton Range. That way I can lay that down on the board and make my tracing with that. And then once the tracing is done, here I'm marking essentially where the bottom of my cut will be, to ensure that way when I'm stacking these boards on top of each other, I've got the alignment correct and where I want it. So now I'm ready to actually stack these 2 boards in preparation for taking them to the bandsaw. So like I mentioned before, going to use blue painter's tape and some CA glue. That way these boards will be locked down together, nice and steady, but won't be permanent. And the last step before taking it to the bandsaw is to just simply trace my vinyl. And I thought about leaving it on there, but I was afraid that vinyl might just kind of be in the way, more or less. So I decided to go ahead and trace that with a pencil. So now it's the moment of truth. Time to put these boards into the bandsaw and see if my idea is going to actually work. And the total time that it took me to make this cut is about 6 minutes. So I'm not going to play the whole thing in real time. We'll do some a little fast, some in real time, just to give you an idea. But as I was doing this, I actually felt pretty good about how things were going. Certainly not a fast process, and I missed a few of the marks, but overall, at this point, I was feeling pretty hopeful. Once the cut was done, I could go ahead and start kind of breaking apart the pieces of wood, which actually was a little harder than I thought. That blue tape and CA glue holds pretty well. And I guess this is really the moment of truth, where I put these boards together to see how well the 2 are going to meet up. And it wasn't great. It wasn't perfect. There were some gaps, and I tried to kind of correct those best I could. I went ahead and put the boards in the clamp and to find kind of where it was bottoming out the most. And there were a couple of points, so marked kind of where that was happening and tried doing some sanding by hand to work those edges down to see if it would bring the boards together. And while it did help some, it certainly didn't get rid of all the gaps. But regardless, perfect or not, it was time to go ahead and glue these up. So pretty simple, put a bunch of glue on the board, one board, and went ahead and put those into the clamp. And one thing I did that I don't usually do was put a piece of painter's tape on the back side, knowing that there were some gaps in there, rather than having the risk of a lot of glue basically bleeding out of the joint. I decided to put some painter's tape on the bottom, and then once it was in the clamp, I could go ahead and start working a little bit of extra glue from the top side on where those gaps are. So now you can get a little bit better view of where these gaps are and just how big they are. And I knew I had to do something to try and correct these. And I kind of tossed around two ideas, either using this Titebond glue, which as you can see, that was the option I went with, or using Starbond CA glue with the brown color. But at the end of the day, the Titebond is technically FDA approved for indirect food contact. So decided to err on the side of caution, and I went with the Titebond. And once the glue up was complete, I ran the board back through the planer one more time just to give it a nice clean finish, and then took it over to the table saw to clean off the edges. And now we're in the home stretch, essentially getting to the finishing aspect of the board. So I always put a routed edge on the top of my board, and I kind of went back and forth as to whether it would work or look better with a rounded edge or beveled edge. I typically go with the beveled, and I probably could have got away with the rounded edge since it would have matched the kind of shape of the mountain peaks. But I guess old habits die hard, so I went with the beveled edge. And then it's just a matter of sanding the board with 100 grit and then 120 grit. And then once that's done, go ahead and give the board a nice spritz of water to go ahead and raise that grain, and then do one final sanding with 150 grit. And finally, we are on the last step, and this is always the most gratifying step of any cutting board. It's when you put that mineral oil on and you see the grain really come to life. So did my normal 2 treatments of mineral oil, and then once those had had ample time to kind of soak in, I did 2 more treatments with the mineral oil and wax combination. Well, cutting board is now done, so I think it's time to answer the question, can I make a mountain-themed Teton Range cutting board? And I think the short answer would be yes, but it wasn't perfect. I think the first issue I had was with a result of my kind of inexperience with bandsaws. I've only had that bandsaw for a little over a month now, and other than kind of playing around with it with scrap wood, this is my first real test with it. And as a result, you may have noticed when I was making the cut on the back side of a couple of these mountain peaks, I missed the mark by about 1/8 of an inch. So it doesn't really throw off the end result too much, but again, you know, I did kind of mess up on that one. The second issue was my kind of change of plans and how I approached making this cut. I think my epiphany to do the stacked boards with a single cut really wasn't that much of an epiphany after all. Again, my lack of experience with the bandsaw may have played into this, but as a result of that attempt or that approach, I created some fairly big gaps where these 2 boards met up. And after filling it with the wood glue, I think if you didn't watch this video and you just looked at the board, you probably wouldn't notice it. It actually blends pretty well with that, that quarter sawn white oak. So I may have gotten away with it on that one. But at the end of the day, I think I would have been better off with my first idea, which would have been to make a cut on one board, trace that to a second, and make a second cut. Reason being is I would have the ability to come at that cut from 2 directions rather than being forced to make a single pass in one direction without being able to kind of go back and I guess more or less kind of inch my way towards that cut line. So I might actually try that other route with another cutting board just to see if it turns out a little bit cleaner. This, at the end of the day, I had to do some pretty large kind of curves on these mountain peaks in order to be able to make that turn with the bandsaw. even with a thin 1/4 inch blade, I was still kind of limited on what kind of cuts I can make. So my Teton Range really kind of maybe looks like waves. So maybe this is an ocean board, I don't know. But either way, I still think the end result is good, but there's certainly some room for improvement. So if I do a second attempt, maybe I'll update this video or throw a second one up there for you guys to see. But regardless, it was a kind of a creative little idea, fun little project, and hope you guys enjoyed the video. And I guess we'll see you on the next build.